Hello, and welcome to Stream of Consciousness Episode 1. My name is Malcolm, and I will be your host tonight. Basically, this podcast is, as the title says, a stream of consciousness, which basically elucidates my thought process and clarifies it from what were originally written notes and pen and ink, ink and paper, to digital notes via various online stuff like Google Drive into a recorded format. So the reason I started is basically because I was always recording my thoughts anyway in one way or another. I figured there is an audio component to do here, and I'd been playing with the idea beforehand, and it was earlier today, in fact, I spoke with someone regarding algorithmic processes whilst we were having what we called a conversation about conversation. And the conversation about conversation basically was to do with her art project, which is a PhD project, which we don't need to go into too much detail with that, as it's not quite the target goal of this podcast. Basically, what I'm trying to do is just understand myself better. I feel that this format lends itself quite well to expression, and frankly, I don't express myself quite as clearly as I want to. And to keep it real with you, like, I am kind of excited about the monetary aspect of it, partially because where I am in life is not where I want it to be, and I feel I can do more. I feel like the station I've reached in life is not. Well, first of all, I'm going to say it's not impressive. I'm not proud of where I am. I'm not happy about where I am. But the problem is, considering where I was, it is technically progress, and I do have things to be grateful for, and there are. I am genuinely. I'm too content with where I am. And I don't want to be like that. I don't want to just accept mediocrity and just back down from things. I feel like too often I just restrain how I express myself for the sake of comforting others. And there has to be a give and take of. It's exactly stuff like that which feels slightly apologetic. Because I do understand there's a give and take in all relationships, I can't just expect to do what I want all the time, every time, and never face any sort of challenge on that. But I know that some people do live that way. They're able to do whatever they want, however they want, whenever they want, wherever they want, with whomever they want, why ever they want. And I kind of want to do that too. And frankly, this medium provides a pathway to that. It might not be perfect, but it's closer to perfect than working for somebody else. I'm so tired of having somebody else as my employer. I'm tired of following orders from people that don't really know what they're doing but pretend that they do. I'm tired of facilitating a system which actively disempowers people that try to get out of it. And the problem with a lot of it is I try to look at everybody's perspective with this sort of thing and be empathetic about it, but there's so many times where the empathy is actually counterproductive to what I'm trying to do. Because if I'm empathetic towards my captors, for example, then I'm enabling my own imprisonment. So the question is then exploring, what are my captors? How am I imprisoned? And I'd say that, God, I don't want to sound like some sort of. I'm trying to avoid making this overly political, but I suppose at some point there will be some political expression, whether it's conscious or not. The tricky thing is, I feel imprisoned generally. I feel like I feel like life by definition is somewhat imprisoning because the consciousness is imprisoned within a physical body. The extent to which that's actual imprisonment, I understand it's not the same as being in a jail cell. Excuse me. But that's the thing, is that there I go again. I start speaking almost overly empathetically when I don't need to, and it feels like a divergent tangent which isn't actually constructive to what I'm trying to do. Like, I don't want to say I have no intention of making money off this, because I do. But I also want to do it because I want to do it. It's, you can have more than one motivation to doing things. And one of my big motivations for doing this is simply because I get to speak about what I want, how I want, etc., and not feel like I have to placate or toe some party line, which I've really noticed in academia. I've really noticed that. So I'm currently at college studying psychology, sociology and biology with the intent of going to university to study neuroscience with psychology. And I'm doing well. I'm top of the class for most of it. I'm taking on additional English and mathematics stuff because my high school qualifications weren't what I want them to be. I don't find the maths I find the English exceptionally easy, and I have to be honest about that. I don't find the maths particularly challenging, and frankly, I've been a little arrogant in class about it. And not intentionally, it was more I took 2 exams on the same day instead of 1 when I could have spaced them out, and I think that was to my detriment. But it was also because I have an impatience that I want to overcome. And I know that if I don't at least address the source of impatience, sorry, then it's never going to resolve. It's just going to fester and potentially make things worse. And one of my things I'm really passionate about talking about is algorithms. Mostly because I understand algorithms are the source of a lot of behavior in the modern world, not just in myself, but societally. I think it's become kind of obvious how much algorithms affect behavior, how much they influence what we do, what we do, when we do, where we do it, etc. And everybody seems to be aware of how pervasive the data mining has become, and at the same time everybody's really ignorant of the consequences of it. And I really think it's time to stop ignoring the consequences of that sort of thing. So my voice might sound a little somber at the moment. I received a little bit of bad news about one of my university selections, which I kind of understood, but it's the reason I'm doing the English and mathematical stuff now. And I think there's also been a misunderstanding about what... So I'm Scottish and I live in England. So my high school grades were in the Scottish education system, and yeah, basically the numerical value of it is in Scotland, the smaller the number, the higher the grade. England, the higher the number, the higher the grade. And I think there might have been some confusion, but I don't want to take the risk with it, so I'm doing those classes anyway. But one other reason for my somber tone right now is I have skipped a jiu-jitsu, well, 2 jiu-jitsu classes technically because they're back to back, to do this podcast. And the reason I did it is because even though I departed from the house ahead of, at the time I'd know, actually slightly before I would normally leave about the normal time I'd leave the house to get there and arrive with time to spare, and the traffic was just too much, and that fucking pissed me off, because I knew as soon as I'd arrive, I might not be able to participate in the first class, and if I did, there'd be a forfeit for it. And honestly, I was embarrassed. It's embarrassing to be late for stuff. And I was really upset about it, and I knew that as well I wanted to do this podcast, because I tried doing one earlier on today, and the first time I did it, for some reason, the whole thing just didn't record whatsoever. The second one, I recorded video, but didn't realise I had to press a button to record audio as well. So we sorted that now. So 3rd time's a charm, apparently. And that whole 3rd time the charm thing feeds into an idea I have about pattern recognition and ratios. But at the same time, I want to address the jiu-jitsu thing before I get too distracted by the pattern stuff, because I will go into that pattern stuff so deeply. I kind of like jiu-jitsu. I think saying I love jiu-jitsu, considering I've been training for about 8 months, is a slightly strong word for it, but I do really enjoy it. There's good company there. it's a really interesting skill. It's very similar to chess. I should note that I'm actually playing chess whilst I record this because it gives me something to focus on. Because I find that when I was conversing with the microphone without having, excuse me, a specific object of focus, I kind of just meandered and like looked around the room and felt kind of, I don't know, it just didn't feel great. It's about the simplest way to put it. And by having, I mean, it's the easiest chess engine, so there's no time limit or anything, and I'm just trying to, you know, keep my, I don't know, have something to focus on, which I think at the same time I'm also trying to notice if there's patterns between what I speak and how I speak, like inflection of tone and stuff. When I, for example, if I click the knight or the bishop or the queen or the rook, and I actually want to learn about screen recording so I can show you guys what is going on with essentially I want to like stream the chessboard and then have my face in the corner of it, and then because, well, I mean, you might want to see my face, but if you can see my face and see what I'm looking at, then maybe it's more interesting, it's more entertaining. I know that for my own, I don't know, it just seems like what I want to do with it, and for too long I've sort of been trying to do what other people want to do. And one of the reasons I actually really love jiu-jitsu is because it's the whole idea of impressing your willpower against their willpower, and the resulting conflict is a conversation. It's been said before that jiu-jitsu works like a conversation, and you expand your vocabulary, you develop your grammar, and as it moves along and you get more adept at it, you more thoroughly understand what you're saying, how you're saying it. So, for example, trying certain moves from certain positions is just unlikely to work, but they can also be considered kind of cheeky, and it's hard to describe that without having done it yourself. But it's in the same way like with climbing. So I quite enjoy climbing. I was a climbing instructor for several years and have recently applied to be a climbing instructor again. And I'm, hopeful about that. So the thing about climbing is nobody climbs the same way. Absolutely impossible to climb identically to somebody else simply because of your biological proportions and like the way you step on, the way you hold things, the way you place your feet, all of that. Like it makes such a difference that whenever you're on the wall, you're just doing your own thing, you're expressing your own way, you're exerting your willpower over the holds, the rock. And a lot of people almost look for like the perfective way to do everything, and it's like there's not going to be one perfect way which everyone can use. There's going to be a sequence which most of us can try, and there might, so with some climbs it's you have to do it that specific way. Depends. Typically with harder climbs it's more or less everybody follows the same sequence. But so much of climbing is very unique, and even then it's the way you move between holds, and the physical tension you have to hold is going to be different between different people. I don't know. Well, I do know actually. I do know. I have the sadness in my voice because I don't want to miss a jiu-jitsu class because I've got a competition coming up at the end of February and I want to be ready for it. And frankly, it's something I've invested a lot of time into and actually want to see good results from because, believe it or not, I give a shit about the stuff I put time and effort into. I think the frustration I'm feeling is partially because I've paid money for the jiu-jitsu. It's part of a monthly thing, so it's not like I'm losing that much of it, but I'm losing value of it. I also said to someone I would be there tonight, and I'm not there tonight, and I haven't explained to them that I'm not there, and that makes me feel shitty. There's also if there's background noise, it's because my housemate is making banging noises for God knows what reason. I don't assume it's anything malicious, I just don't know what it is. But yeah, I think a big part of why I want to do this podcast is not just to hear my thoughts out loud. It's not because I love the sound of my own voice. It's because I've been struggling to find somebody that actually is able to hold the conversation with me. And I know one of the first things I should look for in that situation is my own faults. However, my older group of friends, for example, my friends when I was living in Scotland, that was 2014 and beforehand, I didn't have exceptionally deep conversations with them. A lot of our relationships were, party based. we played music. There was a lot of like recording and stuff that went on, but they weren't particularly deep relationships. Some of them were, but not all of them. And then my next wave of friends, as it were my climbing friends, who I still keep in contact with. And that's one of the reasons I think I wanted to get the climbing job, is to be more of a climber. And with them, it's the same sort of thing, except because I used to smoke a lot of weed, daily at least a joint or two. None of them did. They all drank alcohol, and I barely ever drank alcohol. And I've been sober now for 3 years. It's just sort of the only time I ever felt properly comfortable with vulnerability, especially emotional vulnerability rather than just generally, is post sex, or in any situation where sports helped with it, because when you're trying something difficult, it requires a lot of you. And when you fail at something you've worked so hard at, the way you handle that defeat is a really... Sorry, I have two screens, so if I'm looking at that one and I'm looking at this one, and yeah. And how you handle defeat, I think, says a lot about a person, as well as how you handle victory. And I think because martial arts, defeat is at the hands of another person, as well as victory, it says a lot about how you interact with those you have, demonstrated dominance over, or been dominated by. With climbing, it's not over a specific person. It might be over a person's creation if it's a climb at an indoor centre, but it's not the same as dominating a person directly. And I think a significant issue that I've struggled to deal with is expressing myself without... No, it's not even that. It's not even expressing myself. I'm actually really fucking good at expressing myself. I'm quite articulate. I have a reasonable vocabulary. I understand my mind and my body quite well. And I have little challenge in expressing what goes on in my head, unless it's quite a complex subject. And the tricky part here is, and this is where I don't want to sound arrogant. I don't want to sound like a dick, as it were. But I've struggled to find people that can hold good conversation with me. And this next part feels slightly like intellectual masturbation, but I'm going to try and just describe what I mean, and maybe it'll make more sense in a minute. I am quite intelligent. I have measured my IQ to be, let's just say, above the Mensa entrance requirement. And it's incredibly lonely, because there's not very many people that can actually understand what you think, how you think, as well as you spend a lot of time with less intelligent people. And it's a weird way, I think that there's a strange similarity that wealthy people can empathise with, that as well as athletic people, and I think musicians to some extent as well. There's lots of different lanes you can analyse it through. When I say lanes, because I realise that you guys can't read my mind, is, well, it's just different ways, perspectives to look at it. So you can have like a legal perspective, a medical perspective, an economic perspective, a physics perspective, a chemistry perspective, a biology perspective, psychological perspective, athletic perspective, artistic perspective, a purely engineering perspective. There's a lot, there's so many different ways you can look at things, that by understanding the different perspectives you get a better understanding for what you're actually talking about. And what I'm trying to say is that with higher intelligence, it makes it really easy to translate concepts within your head. Like, you understand stuff quicker, and sometimes when you don't understand it terrifically, you just think of it in a different context and you pick it up straight away. And most people get that. Say, for example, they're learning something new, then they'll talk about that something new with appropriate context, perhaps their profession or their passion, or well, like there's a lot of like really universally applicable ways, like time management or family or intimate relationships, or technology's become a really common one. Like a lot of people will understand, even if they don't necessarily own the technology, they'll understand what you mean via technology. I don't know. I guess in some weird way, because I believe the singularity has already happened, and humans are effectively like. There's a quote by I can't remember who his name is, but I wanted in credits. I'm going to find that. I'm clicking out of the chess game into my Google Drive. There's a quote by a chap who talks about how humans are the sex organs of machines. Marshall McLuhan. And the direct quote is, "Man becomes, as it were, the sex organs of the machine world, as the bee of the plant world, enabling it to fecundate and to evolve over new forms. The machine world reciprocates man's love by expediting his wishes and desires, namely in providing him with wealth." And that quote speaks to a lot of things in my life about what I want to do. And honestly, my perspective on how recording this and then publishing it will enable, or at least facilitate, an avenue towards wealth. And that more, what do you call, I don't know, non-personal information, but I always think this is something I've noticed, that everything I talk about, everything I write about, everything I communicate, and everything that's communicated to me, there's levels to it, and you can hear the levels in it, and it's something that I think competitive people pick up on. I know musicians pick up on, because to them it's just like different keys you're recording in. I think most academics can pick up on it in their own way. I think business people pick up on it on their own way. And I think everybody does to some extent, but those are the ones that I personally relate to more. And the music one, I think, especially because that's such a universally understandable context, as it were. So I'm trying to sit upright, because if I sit back in my chair, I'm like this, and I'm super far away from the microphone. Would that work? I tried it beforehand, I wasn't super keen on it. But if I come up here, it's just me. My voice is a lot clearer. I could move the microphone to my side and lean back, which would be a lot more comfortable, and then my back might not ache as much. But let's not get too fussed about it. Let's not get too fussy. Right, if we move that to the side a little. What do you think of that? Okay. Well, that's not terrible, actually. My half concern is that my diaphragm might be slightly compressed. Does that work? No, that does actually. We come in here, and my voice still is picked up pretty well. So if I turn that a little bit, bring that in a little bit, it feels a little in my face, but I can look at the screen, and you can all hear me quite clearly. Ideally, I'd have like a microphone here in front of me, but you know, I got this ages ago and I wanted to do everything standing up for music recordings, rather than explicitly podcasts. And I do love music. It is one of my favourite things. And actually, this is something I've picked up on, which I guess a lot of musicians have as well, is that with music, a lot of people talk about having music in their veins, and having music in your veins seems like it's just metaphorical, but I don't think it is. I really don't. I think there's something about music that really does seep into humans as individuals. There's something about it, it's like the understanding of the time signature really, really does affect human beings. I think it programs them. I think music to some extent does. I don't know if that's going to affect the video. So I clicked something. There's a watermark on the screen that says activate Windows, go to settings, activate Windows. I tried to close it with something else, but it didn't work. Yeah, there's a book by Howard Gardner which talks about different kinds of intelligences, And basically, musical intelligence is one of them. And I think musical intelligence is it's how you hear things. You hear tone, you hear keys, and you hear intent. Because my perspective on, well, all art is that the most honest art, the best art, is a perfect expression of self. It's honest. It has to be honest. If it's not honest, there's no point to it. And if there's no point to it, then sorry, I need to do something here. Basically, most art is a result of pain or love. Sometimes both. Pain, love, and with hip hop, I would add ambition to that as well. I think, though, that pain and love are primarily the forms that we express music by. See, I don't even mind that seems like slightly tangential to the whole podcast, simply just because I want it to be an honest representation of how I'm feeling, how I'm thinking. Because I spend way too much time thinking about thinking. And I don't hate it, I enjoy thinking about thinking. But I know that by actively ignoring my feeling, devaluing my feelings, I don't really embrace them in the same way. And part of that's because I've been doing this whole reprogramming thing, which as this podcast goes on, I will go into further detail and explain. Perhaps not this episode, but in the future. I'll explain. Basically, I wanted to reprogram myself because I didn't really like where I was. As I said at the beginning, there's a lot of things in my life that I wasn't happy about, and I'm still not happy about. And I think it's a curse of consciousness. There are people always say, "I'll be happy for what you have, be grateful for what you've got," and I don't disagree with that statement. I think it's important to have gratitude for what you do have, but I also think that once you are expressly happy with everything you have, it can kill ambition. That might just be me. Actually, you know what? I'm not even sure if I believe all that statement. There's something about. Well, how am I trying? I know what I'm trying to say. It's how to say it. Because it feels like ambition and happiness are in direct conflict by the mere definition of ambition. Because the simple fact that you're ambitious states that you're not content with the current state. So if you're ambitious, you're not happy. You can't be happy. Because if happiness is defined as a state of contentment, of, how do you want to call it? Serendipity? I'm not sure if that's the right word. I'm going to have to check the definition on that. But if contentment is simply being at peace with everything, then that seems antithetical to ambition. Because ambition is typically born of the idea that what you have isn't enough. And the problem with being ambitious is once you start accomplishing the goals you set out for yourself, you realize that nothing's enough. It will never be enough. And, there's definitely psychological reasons that cause that. I won't pretend to know them all. I probably should have a better understanding of them as a psychology student. But it's not what I want to talk about right now. I'm not trying to avoid the topic, it's just I don't want to deviate too much. I have this terrible habit of going off on tangents, which when I'm talking with somebody else, it's actually really useful because then sometimes it provides more insight to what I'm doing. But when I'm writing in any way, shape, or form, going off on tangents usually just distracts me from the original point, and then I have to consider what's distracting me. And yes, of course, you can say, well, he's playing chess, maybe that's distracting him, but Not really that much. It's actually quite calming. It's it's kind of, I don't know. I was gonna say it's like the smoker's habit of having to keep your hands busy, and it is kind of like that. It just means I can do something whilst talking. But yeah, the whole musical perspective thing I was talking about is an extension of understanding how wealth and general success is actually really lonely. Is no matter what hierarchy you're climbing, whether that be a financial hierarchy, an athletic capability hierarchy, an intellectual capability hierarchy, a chess prowess hierarchy, whatever it is, the further you climb, the closer you get to the top. One, the less role models you have to seek advice from, and two, the more people you have looking up to you. And that's lonely. Because when people look up to you, you then become their role model. You become their mentor to the mentee. You become their teacher to their student. And that's especially odd if you were their mentee beforehand. If you were when the student becomes the master, that shift of dynamic is how you handle it and how they handle it is critical to the continuation of that relationship in whatever way, shape, or form it takes. But the higher you go up any hierarchy, whether it's a dominance hierarchy, competence hierarchy, what I call a confidence hierarchy, because I'm sure we've all noticed in life people that are exceptionally confident in themselves but not necessarily great at what they do seem to do quite well for themselves simply because they have that belief. They're able to believe in themselves. And, excuse me, hierarchies generally reflect merit. Competence hierarchy, dominant, a confidence hierarchy, sorry, a competence hierarchy reflects merit. A confidence hierarchy, you could argue, reflects self-esteem. A dominance hierarchy reflects, instinctively I wanted to say aggression, but that's not necessarily like, because you get like a sexual dominance hierarchy. Well, let's say for example, you could have a room full of men, sort of like proportionally 90-10 men to women, and the 90 men might all be more aggressive than the 10% women, but the 10% women might be so sexually attracted to the men that they influence the behavior of the entire group. So dominant hierarchies work in multiple ways that way. And dominance as a biological trait as opposed to recession is in some ways sexually transmitted. So sexual dominance hierarchies are actually a thing, and I think a way bigger part of society than a lot of people want to admit, and way more than a lot of people recognise. But my point with competence hierarchies, because I feel that's that's a much more objective measurement, is the higher you get with them, the harder it is to relate to other people. So, for example, an intelligent person is going to struggle to relate to less intelligent people if they're not able to eh, wholly, completely express themselves. And because of the bell curve distribution of IQ, as well as, like, well, most skills and stuff, then basically it just becomes a point where everybody at the top can relate to other people at the top, but there's a larger disparity between skills and resources and stuff like that. So if everybody's average, everybody can relate to one another. If we accept that there will always be haves and have-nots, as there has always been, then we accept that there will always be disparity in understanding. Some of us will understand better than others, and ideally we should find those that understand us best. The trouble is if there's a change in hierarchical position that cannot be imitated by other members of the previous hierarchy. So let's say we have a competence hierarchy. So for example, I do a lot of sports, primarily jiu-jitsu, climbing. I do like gym and running as well, so I might use those as literary devices as well. But let's say I started training jiu-jitsu at the same time as about 8 other people because we did our beginner's course together. But it has become somewhat obvious that out of all those people, I progressed the furthest. Part of that is because I'm tall and was already in very good physical shape beforehand. I've been doing sports literally since I can remember, and have been an active gym goer since for nearly 12 years now. And in all the sports I've competed in, in swimming I won a lot of medals. I often made podiums. I think up to the regional, maybe not national level, but was reasonably good at swimming. Football, I started a few times. I was always part of the team. I always got taken to matches. The team wasn't particularly strong, but I still, if there's 20 odd people training and you're starting matches, you're not the worst there. But football was never my strongest suit. It's fun though. Taekwondo, I was a junior black belt. What else did I do? Basketball, I was on the national under-16s team. Didn't play, but I trained with them because it was off season that I got recruited up to it, and then I had to stop because of injuries, which sucked. Really annoyed about that. Rugby, school team, always started. Skateboarding was kind of when I deviated from like organized sport into more independent sport, but still kind of, just did. I think I was in skateboarding mostly because of the social aspect. At the time I got into it is because my mum's cancer had gotten more aggressive, and I think that was, I don't know, I think it was kind of a rebellious phase, I suppose. Um, Post skateboarding, I got into powerlifting, where I held a, granted, only Scottish national record, but still a national record for a short while, and won my weight classes. After that, I got into climbing, and I didn't really compete in climbing, but out of all my friends, in my closer group of friends, I was usually the strongest, always top three, and even though I was, socially amicable with stronger climbers, the people I climbed with the most, I was always trying to find stronger people to climb with, but there's kind of like a clickiness with it. But I think that's reflected in any sort of stuff. And what I mean by that is the wealthier you become as a person, the more likely you are to hang out with wealthy people. In the same way that the stronger a climber you become, the more likely you are to hang out with stronger climbers. In the same way that the more qualified you become, like academically, like the more time you spend around doctoral candidates and doctors, the more likely you are to think like a doctor. You're more likely to improve your reasoning, stuff like that. And I think that clickiness is kind of natural. I think it's a result of something quite organic. I think a lot of people don't like admitting that. I think, and this is where it's going to become slightly political, and I don't want to. I don't want to assign myself to any sort of political affiliation. If I'm pretty sure just by speaking on this podcast, my political views and alignments will somewhat reveal themselves. And if not, I don't really pay my. I feel a lot of politics just an extension of philosophy and opinion. It is basically the same thing, just at a different level. So, yeah, and I'm sure that if my following gains traction enough that I get people that are commenting on these pages and stuff, or like have guests on, then like it'll at least provide more reference for what am politically inclined to agree with or disagree with. I just don't want to. What's the word? I don't know. It feels like a lot of politics is just a circus and is there to keep people busy rather than actually solve the problems. I think a lot of politicians are in it for the wrong reasons. I think a lot of politicians who get into it for the right reasons are then corrupted, and I have a lot of views on that corruption, which could probably warrant its own podcast. And I'm I love that I'm slightly concerned about brand appeal right now when this is episode 1, but yeah, I'm very aware that some of my beliefs on how the political system works are definitely non-mainstream, to say the least. But controversy sells, so maybe it'll be a good idea to talk about that at some point. But yeah, I suppose what's the word? Presenting theme. Go with that. I suppose the presenting theme of this podcast is how success is lonely, and I think one of the biggest issues with that is how empathy towards success is actually kind of uncommon, because they're like, oh well, let's say you're a millionaire, you're a billionaire, you're 6'3", you're in very good physical shape, you have a beautiful wife, beautiful children, you have all these wonderful things about you. What have you got to complain about? You don't get to complain. It's like, well, no, if anything, you're trying. Those are attempts to invalidate somebody else's human experience, and the invalidation of a human experience is usually specifically what that kind of person is very much against. That kind of person is very typically wants to make sure that everybody is equally heard and equally given an opportunity, which I agree with. I think everybody has that as a human right, as the equality of opportunity. I agree with. I think that's fair. It levels the playing ground. But the tricky thing is when you have something like equality of opportunity for higher skill based stuff. Let's say, so for example, there's a lot of investment opportunities which aren't available to people that don't have a certain amount of capital, simply because the amount of literacy required to understand what they're doing usually isn't acquired until they have that capital. In the same way, like a lot of competitions, like sporting competitions, but competitions generally aren't available to people below a certain skill cap, simply because, well, like let's say for example martial arts, if a white belt goes up against a black belt, it's not a competition for the black belt, and the white belts, all right, fine, you can say gives them their chance, but they're just wasting their time. The odds of a white belt defeating a black belt are so ridiculously small that for that to genuinely happen, then that white belt would likely be a black belt in something else to begin with. But then it's much better to put the white belts against the white belts and have an outlying white belt that knows that they're really experienced and will not go too hard with it, than a white belt masquerading as a black belt going up against other black belts and having very serious consequences. If you put on a black belt when you're not one and enter a competition and you go up against other black belts, that other black belt is going to see another black belt and they are going to attack you as another black belt. And that's where the whole equality of opportunity thing is. I know it's typically applied to like societal constructs, but humans are not all made the same. We all have biological differences, we have genetic differences, and I think I'm talking about something that I think is becoming overtly politicalized, even though I'm trying to describe it from a purely biological standpoint, is we aren't all the same, and I don't think it's fair to pretend that we are all the same. I remember when I was a kid, the whole idea of celebrating our differences was a massive deal, and nowadays the same phrase except the word diversity is used as celebrating our diversity. Diversity is our strength, and yeah, exactly. If diversity is our strength, then we have to accept that there's a diversity of skill level, there's a diversity of intelligence. Because if we all accept that genetics can affect physical ability, then we have to accept that genetics can affect cognitive ability. That's just how that works. And I think ignoring that is to be in denial of basic biology. And I think that creates problems at a higher level. And it's these sort of conversations that people with IQ beyond a certain threshold are able to engage in. and even if they don't necessarily agree with it, they'll entertain it and like play devil's advocate, or they'll actually try and see your point of view. But people with IQ below a certain threshold, which tends to be the majority of people simply because of IQ distribution, they don't respond to it very rationally. And I'm trying to say that I don't mean to be condescending. I don't mean to sound rude at all when I say that. But I've noticed that explicitly emotional responses typically occur from lower IQ. That feels really. I don't think it should be a controversial statement, but it feels like it might be interpreted as such. Because you see that in sports, like the best of the best, part of their journey to skill mastery is emotional regulation. Whether that's in martial arts or in climbing or football or powerlifting or whatever, like a certain degree of emotional amplitude will aid somebody, but it's also at the same time, if you're unable to regulate your emotions during sporting events, then you do put yourself at a disadvantage. Especially with combat sports. Like if you're allowing yourself to get too emotional whilst in the ring or on the mats or in the cage, well, your opponent's just going to pick you apart. It just becomes easier. They're going to use your emotions against you. And the tricky thing is, the artistic side of martial arts is there is an expression to it. And when you're sparring with people and stuff, that comes forward. But in competition, it's different. In competition, that emotional aspect, if it can be used against you, you have to work on the basis that it will be used against you. Very similar to like what you say being used against you in a court of law. And a lot of people don't like to accept the responsibility for the negative outcomes of their emotional behaviour. Say, for example, impulse buying. I'm very frustrated with myself because last night I impulsively bought myself a takeaway pizza because I was kind of hungry, even though I knew explicitly I could overcome the craving by distracting myself with something like playing guitar. And I should have done that really. But the weird thing is I also was hungry enough that I didn't feel bad about it. I didn't feel bad about ordering the pizza because I was that hungry. So by being in that state of hunger, I altered the rule set's application. It's like the saying, sometimes rules are meant to be broken, and that may as be so, but if you create yourself your own personal code of conduct to live by and you don't abide by it, what's the point of having a code of conduct in the first place? So if you want to create equality of opportunity for people, then you have to set a framework by which the equality of opportunity, it is not a direct equation, I understand that, but bear with us. If you want to have a world where equality of opportunity is available for everybody, then you have to accept what playing field people are being entered into. Because otherwise, you're going to have people that are just better. Some people are just better at things. And it doesn't matter whether it's athletic or intellectually. Some people will be smarter. Some people will be stronger or faster or whatever. That's just the way they're born. And making them feel bad for that is exactly the sort of personal attack that egalitarians are trying to avoid in the first place. For example, if you're obstructing equality of opportunity based on other genetic markers that people can't control, such as skin colour, for example, then it is a bit of a dick move, to put it lightly. There are plenty of very capable people from all skin tones. The point I'm trying to make is that there will be certain people that are faster and stronger and smarter and stuff, and there are people that are weaker and slower and dumber. And in that context, we have to provide a relatively appropriate playing field. In the same way that if you put chess grandmasters up against people that have just learnt the rules, chess grandmasters going to obliterate them. It's not going to be a competition, and the person that's just learnt the rules might get put off of chess altogether. It's quite a common theme with people that are like new to martial arts or new to chess, that if they're going up against somebody that's considerably more experienced, the more experienced person deliberately takes it easy on them. They're not going to let them win, but they take it a little bit easy on them if it's very obvious that they're definitely a newbie. Sometimes people have like alternative experience which translates really well. Like if you're new to jiu-jitsu but you've done a lot of wrestling, or you're new to Thai boxing but you've done a lot of K1, or if you're new to chess but you've played a lot of Go, you're likely to understand a lot of the tactics and stuff really quickly, even if you don't understand the direct technicalities. It's like if you play lots of sports, you're going to be good at most other sports. If you play a lot of musical instruments, you're going to be reasonably adept at any new musical instrument. And I'm trying to better understand how to, I think, politically correct express there are haves and have-nots, especially in the economic system. So circling around to the whole idea of success being lonely, I think that the wealthier you become, as a lot of people like to say, oh yeah, but still they're pretty down to earth, they're quite grounded in reality. It's like that's cool, but a lot of the time, I think wealthy people have to actively work at that. They have to be aware of who they're hanging around with and stuff. It's not. Some people will be quite naturally good at maintaining who they are, but if you come from abject poverty and you become a millionaire within the span of a month or two, the things you spend money on is probably going to change slightly. At the very least, you're likely to buy some slightly nicer food. You're probably going to have some slightly nicer clothes. You might buy a slightly nicer car, have a slightly nicer home. Even if you don't, dive straight into it and buy yourself some luxury car and a mansion, or, and all the designer brands and stuff, and eat out every night. If you're coming from, abject poverty, you are obviously going to spend that money on slightly nicer things because that was the whole point of making that money in the first place. And there will always be critics. There will always be people that say, "Oh, why is he spending his money on that or this or the other?" And it's like, so a recent example was a certain billionaire made an acquisition of a certain branch of social media, and there's been a lot of criticism of how that 43 billion whatever was spent. And it's like, that's their money. At the end of the day, nobody has a right to tell them how to use it. Excuse me. If anybody else came into your life and told you how to spend your money, you would likely respond somewhat, defensively. Because you're like, what gives you the right to tell me how to behave? Who died and made you king, as it were? And at the same time, understanding the alternative perspective is, well, yeah, when you're that, it's like a lot of intelligent people feel the responsibility to teach, and the way you could argue that wealthy people have a responsibility to redistribute wealth to those that need it. But wealth and intelligence aren't acquired the same way. They're not stored the same way. And they're not retrieved the same way. I know that sounds. So I'm trying to study something at the same time in my head. But intelligence, natural intelligence, is acquired genetically, which, let's be honest, is kind of a lottery. Not really something you have a lot of direct control over that we know of. For all we know, there's karmic laws in place that actually do affect what happens in life. Who knows? Maybe that is how it works. But typically, wealth is acquired. You can inherit wealth and stuff, and I understand that a lot of people that become wealthy start off wealthy. But there's a lot of people that start off, making 3 figures a month that end up making 9 or 10 figures. Like having 9 or 10 figures bank balances, or a combination of their assets and net worth and whatever. because once you get to that point, you use your money to make more money. In the same way that like the more intelligent you become, the more you try to delegate menial responsibilities to those around you. In the same way that you assign responsibility differently. You assign yourself responsibility for more intellectually challenging things simply because you've gotten there. So let's say you're a doctor and you're working in a lab. If there's the cutting edge experiment and then there's the simple lab work of like cleaning things and data entry and all stuff, you're not going to do all the data entry. You're going to assign that work to one of your, assistants or another PhD candidate, because it's a better use of their time than it is your time. In the same, this is what I mean with the whole like equality of opportunity thing. Like, if that person passes that test of character, as it were, if they can accept the modesty required to do a somewhat menial task on their journey towards their doctorate, there we go, then when the time comes for them to have doctoral candidates in their care, they understand that the assignment of such a responsibility isn't to assert superiority or assert dominance or anything. It's simply because that's a better use of their time. In the same way that if you apply equality of opportunity to everything, you're going to have a misallocation of resources, because we aren't all genetically identical, and to pretend that we are is ignorant. But the whole loneliness aspect, I think I've covered kind of thoroughly. But the sad part is a lot of people aren't very empathetic towards loneliness. They'll say they are, and a lot of people listening to this will say they are. Still though, myself included, I do my best to be available to those I care about. I really do. The problem is there comes a point in life where you have to prioritize other things. You have to prioritize yourself. You have to prioritize your family over their family. But that's a reflection of natural selection. If you prioritize somebody else's kids over your own, your kids aren't going to be able to procreate themselves, aren't necessarily going to be procreating themselves. Meaning your genetic lineage, which is kind of like the whole biological meaning of life, ends. Which means a lot of things. But if you become the last of your bloodline, then there's an unbroken lineage that goes back millions, a very, very long time, which has ended with you. And it's not to say that everybody should have kids. I don't think kids is for everyone. The question is, if you're prioritizing other people over yourself, at what point is that altruism self-destructive? And that brings us to around about an hour. I suppose that's a good point to end on, is what's the difference between altruism and self-destructiveness? How far does altruism go before it becomes self-destructive? Is altruism ultimately an expression of the ego? Like, I've accomplished so much that I'm able to, I don't even need to help myself anymore, I can help you. And at the same time, is it unreasonable to consider altruism's compassionate element as useful? Is compassion a very useful aspect of humanity? We can argue yes, because it helps find diamonds in the rough, as it were, which ultimately help the greater good. But then, how do we provide opportunity to diamonds in the rough that, if we were operating on an entirely equal playing field that doesn't give the diamond in the rough any advantage, the diamond in the rough's never going to be set into a wedding band or, uh, you know, other piece of jewelry. If you have an equal, if you have an opportunity where everybody gets the equal opportunity from it, then you have to be able to identify the outstanding members within that field and present them with the opportunities that you wouldn't present to everybody else because the others haven't demonstrated the quality of it. The reason I say this, and I'm wrapping up, is I think there's a problem with the understanding of how equality of opportunity should be applied. It's not scalable. That's the problem with equality of opportunities. It's not scalable. And yeah, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, and I really hope you did, please tell me what you enjoyed about it in the comments. Give us a like, subscribe, share, anything you want to do. It's completely up to you. Yeah, thanks for listening. Tune in next time.